All right, well, while we're getting started, thank you everybody for taking the time to join us to talk about a very interesting use case, but overall, how finance and operations are coming together. It is April Fool's Day, but we are not going to make a lot of, I don't even know, April Fools, but getting into, let's talk about what is on the agenda. So the first thing is I'm going to introduce the team that was part of implementing the solution. And also we're going to talk about specifically one area, but Maxar has done multiple different types of use cases over the years. Then we're going to do a demonstration. So how does this look like? And please ask questions in the chat and we'll try to answer as quickly as we can. And then at the end, we are going to have a Q&A. So that's another opportunity for you to ask any additional questions after we've talked about the journey, the approach, and also the demo. So who is presenting? First, we're going to have Yasser. He's a finance leader, also was an interim CFO at Maxar, has been there many years, has a lot of experience in the space, and also working with Anaplan. Becca Buell, who is a director, she's going to talk about the maturity and as you evolve in this specific area around project planning and connecting it with finance. And then Kate Chira, who's our ninja rock star, going to demo and was the architect in this space. So who is Spaulding Ridge? We are a consulting firm, a global consulting firm, and we have made bets in the cloud space. So these are the different technologies that we have decided that is best in cloud. And we are also globally, not just in North America, but in Europe, in APAC and LATAM. Something that is important to us is we look at processes and the challenges that our clients, such as Maxar, are facing, and how does technology enable it. So where we're really going to drill into is that supply chain, resource management, and financial planning integrated solution. So from here, I'm going to pass it off to Yasser, who's going to give you a little bit of background of who he is, what Maxar does, and what their journey looks like.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so who are we at Maxar? Well, we're a large space solutions company. You can see on the slide here, ultimately, we have been, delving into multiple different areas in the space environment, but ultimately what we're trying to do is expand from what we were, which was a heritage manufacturing company, to integrate and be a large space-based solution architect. And you can see here, ultimately, our core products, we basically build the platforms out of our Bay Area locations. We have robotics and servicing out of Southern California. We have satellite access and imagery based out of Westminster, Colorado. And we also have wings out on the East Coast associated with some of our government acquisitions in Virginia. You can see the size of the company. We run it at about $2 billion a year, over 4,300 employees. It's really, it's definitely a growing business, well-diversified, segmented across both the on-orbit services as well as the on-the-ground manufacturing. And we're really trying to grow and drive into new markets based on those technologies, which leads to our next slide, which is basically what we decided to try to endeavor and do here at Maxar, based on the fact that we ultimately were looking for areas of expansion and trying to figure out how to be able to do it efficiently, effectively, and truly in an integrated manner, so we didn't run into all the problems that most businesses run into when you try to grow, which is ultimately growing can be inefficient if you don't do it in a structured manner, and ultimately cannot necessarily afford it. As we all know, manufacturing margins are generally pretty tight. So what you'll see here is what we ultimately, our long-term roadmap and what we've done here at Maxar was try to first figure out, which you see back in 2016, was the right solution to go with a full-up ERP replacement or come up with a more surgical targeted approach. And what we decided to do is say, you know what? We think we can attack this because once we did a data analysis, dove into it, decided our source data was actually good. Our problem was we had no analytics, no true, what I'll say, forecast capability above and beyond people doing work in Excel. And we had to improve that. We had to get more efficient, streamlined, and really figure out how we're going to drive margins, profit, and growth in the business. So we said, okay, we sat with the management team and said, how do we want to design and manage our business? Which is why we decided to say we needed to attack our P&L tools first, which sometimes is a little harder to do, but what I'll say was a core need for us to define for the business what we needed from them by creating a GL architecture, by creating a business metrics, business tracking, how we wanted to try to grow and drive the business performance. So we decided to start with a P&L implementation. Of course, as you all can see it, we went through P&L and P&L optimization there for almost 2 years. And that just has to do with, as we all know, business changes, mergers and acquisitions happen. We had a large acquisition between 2016 and 2018 that forced the business to pause, take a look, figure out how we're going to integrate, optimize, and move forward. After a period there of pause, we then basically dove back in, you'll see in 2018, where we really focused on now, once we had figured out our path forward under our new consolidated Maxar business, whereas before we were only a manufacturing company, we said, okay, let's drive growth, optimize the business for what our GFO team, meaning our sales team and our strategic architecture team was trying to drive in terms of product mix, customer base, and then we kicked it off again, went hard after that, and you'll see that after basically we delivered a lot of optimizations, which really allowed for better segmentation of our business. We then dove into how we can use this to expand and create better integrated planning through creating simple things like now that we had optimized our business construct, we could build a fixed asset module to better manage our CapEx spend. Then we decided to really dive in and go into a full up operations model build, which was a great learning experience for the business, but ultimately allowed us to leverage a lot of what we had built into the tools, strong data sets, and then leverage and provide the business much better data real time, because all of our old tools had almost zero reporting capability or very limited reporting capability. And now we had actually rolled out and built a live planning tool that allowed for much better forecasting, segmentation of cost center basis, work breakdown structure, just a lot of stuff that frankly we are really excited to be utilizing today. Okay, and then what you'll see here was this last project, which is the last one you see noted on that chart, was basically we looked at and said, well, we're pivoting significantly in our business to try to really expand on our government work. And what I'll say is our national government work, which to those in the industry know, it's basically the DoD, NRO, your customers that basically require a higher level of fidelity in their data and apply a lot of CAS and FAR compliance regulations to our contracts. So that involved a true, what I'd say, partnership with us in Spaulding to dive into what it was going to take to get this in place, because ultimately the security structures, the complexity of breaking things down to the task level as opposed to the department level was a challenging effort to take on, and normally is only done through full ERP replacements. So you can see here basically what we did was try to figure out how to leverage and create a new level for cost account managers in our system, had to satisfy customers across the board in the operations area, and figure out how to then control and provide operational views that would allow, what I'll say, all of our department managers to better see their resource conflicts, resource demand issues, shortfalls, skill set weaknesses across the board, looking at one tool real time with I won't say constant data flow, but we'll say on a weekly basis, getting new data in there. Whereas before we used to be in a life cycle where you'd only see data on a quarterly basis. So it was a real step forward, and ultimately what I'll say here is very exciting for this business to be moving forward. And you'll see basically the notes on here. I don't need to dive in every individual element here, but it was a hell of an expansion, because ultimately when we started with Anaplan, we had 25 licenses and only finance users, and now we've expanded across the board to have over 200 end users dependent on these systems. And ultimately, what I'll say, generally happy and excited to be utilizing and having access to the data they've never been able to get real time before. So now I think that's enough here, and I'll pass it. Okay, no, I guess I'm still going. All right, so
all good, Yasser. So this piece, Yasser, thanks for going over such detail on your journey with Anaplan for the past few years, right? We've seen you go through thinking of the finance lens, thinking of cash flow, and how do we get a full integrated finance and operations solution. And so what we're going to walk the folks in the line through today is really how we approached that maturity model and how we're thinking in partnership with you the next steps, right? And how do we move forward to get the full integrated solution and kind of those puzzle pieces coming together in the honeycomb. So we'll go through all of the details as we kind of go through this maturity model, but where we really started in the most recent go live and kind of the project planning double click is thinking through how do we really help the project planning process at that task level or the work breakdown structure level instead of being at the project or department level, because that's really where the accountability for some of those costs reside, is at that task level. And then also thinking through, how do we make sure the approval process and flow between operations and finance is really being driven and aligned across the board with versioning as well. And then next, once all of the financials are underway, understanding how we marry in the flexibility of bringing in earned value and scheduling. So we've got that marriage of schedule and cost. And then also, in the long term, considering the more detailed resource planning at maybe the named level and consideration of evaluating different suppliers with POs as they come through. So this is kind of our end-to-end view, and we'll double click on the more immediate need and solution to start. And Kate's going to be going through a demo that actually showcases the answers to a lot of these questions. So I won't go through all of them in detail, but the primary questions and business needs that are being addressed with the short-term solution is exactly what Yasser referenced, right? How can a department manager understand how their demand for the folks in their organization are impacted when major programs that are being run by the business change, when dates are extended, when scope changes, when the customers need different needs? How is that impacting the ultimate workforce plan and the labor supply and demand? Additionally, when you have a baseline budget, how are the labor rates that may evolve over time affecting the ending budget at completion? And as all of those changes are happening, how do we make sure the approval flow between finance, those program managers, and folks that are responsible at the task level are in agreement at the end of the day when the reforecasts are happening? And then, of course, there's the element of non-labor spend as well and planning for new risks and opportunities. So I think there's a lot of really relevant questions that I've seen a lot of folks that are approaching project planning. Actually, this solution is addressing. So with that, I will turn it over to Kate to do a demo of the solution.
All right. Hey, everybody. Let me get my screen shared here. All right. So what I'm going to walk through is basically the life cycle of what a project representative or a project manager would use in order to address milestone incremental changes. So what we have here is this is a generalized landing page. It allows the person who is managing a project to evaluate quickly how their budget to actuals and spend to date is progressing, as well as address maybe specific milestones. So milestones can be based off of dates. It can be based off of percentages. In this case, it's based off of dates. And so the story that we are going to kind of follow is, if I were the manager of satellite 1, which we see here, I would know that there is an excess that I would need to address in order for me to keep our actual to budget consumption more along the timeline of what we assume to be. Just to kind of give general overview of Anaplan, if I were to change this between products, we use satellites in this case, just out of respect for Maxar, the photos and the images dynamically change as well. So projects are split into 2 different areas. So they are split into labor as well as the non-labor, with different elements making up those different areas. So in regards to labor, it's hours. It can also go into other increments of hours if there are things that have to do with like man months or any other kind of incremental change. This page would allow us the ability to compare each satellite that is being produced, and also dynamically change the data that we are seeing once again here to know maybe, whereas this one doesn't have as much of a forecast for this upcoming year as compared to satellite 2 and satellite 1, it kind of helps a project manager address the areas of impact that they need to make those changes. So satellite 1 is where we are going to spend the majority of our time. But as you can see, if I were in charge of 3 satellites, I'd have the ability to dynamically change between all 3 without having to get too much into the granularity. So going to this page, this takes us now to where we actually do make those labor adjustments. So in order for us to make sure that every aspect of this project is being addressed, adjustments need to be made at that lowest level. And so up here, we are seeing basically the spend to date versus what has actualized. And this is also telling us what has already been submitted and what is already being approved. But if we scroll down here, this is actually where we make that manpower adjustment. So rather than thinking of their projects at that high level, at just the project level, this is taking us to the accounts, taking us to the tasks, and then one level further, it takes us to that org. Because the orgs are the lowest level of this hierarchy, that would be where we'd make our adjustments. What's really cool about Anaplan is rather than seeing all of these and having to scroll through, we can click on engineering right here. And if we want to take it even one step further, I can click to just address the electrical need and demand in our engineering department. So rather than having to scroll, if I want to impact these numbers that I'm seeing here, they seem pretty low because we still know that this project is going to be continuing for another few months. Now, if I go and I switch this selector to override the hours, I can go into here and only impact what we see moving forward. So you'll see that dynamically changes. And this now can be extended to address a need by our suppliers to improve and add another engineer in our electrical department. One of the big challenges that we saw at Maxar was that we don't want our suppliers, or we don't want a department manager to have to go through each individual project to see where their supplier's hours allocation is. Rather than seeing their demand and having to go and poke through each of these individual areas and say, okay, that's what my supplier's contribution is, and do kind of that manual math. Instead, what was needed is that the suppliers themselves are more interested in this project based off of them being that top level planning. So if I go into here to organizer management and organizer manager hours and labor rate, this is the same data for suppliers, but rather than seeing satellite at that top level, I am now seeing satellite as a child of the suppliers. So I can evaluate my manpower demands, excess and supply in this aspect. So again, working with suppliers in this context is taking more of a supply and demand approach and seeing supply of hours as a variable that needs to be addressed in kind of a supply chain aspect. So rather, the demand in order for them to be able to produce the satellite is showed here as their forecast, but based off of calculations, there is either an excess or there is a short. So excess is being seen in red and a short is being seen in green. And based off of how much there is, it's different shades that are happening here. So if I need to actually reduce the amount here, I can simply copy this and paste it up here. And now I've addressed that excess that we were seeing previously and making sure that the forecast that is being used moving forward addresses the needs that we've discussed. Scrolling down here, similar to what I was saying before, rather than seeing satellites as parents, we see satellites as children. And then I would be able to address the engineering or machinery need and demand based off of this table. If we remember, so if I'm back to that project landing page, I also have to think about the non-labor impact to a project. So labor is one side, non-labor is the other. So let me just click back into satellite 1 right here. And now I'd go into the non-labor adjustments. What this is telling us is basically how to address those expenses that are related to a project that do not have to be labor specific. So in this case, we have unplaced POs, shipping, bonus benefits, others, travel, certain generalized non-labor expenses. And similarly, we have the ability to accept or reject any sort of any sort of request. As a project rep accepts and rejects different types of requests, they are then approved by supervisors. So if I were to go into a supervisor dashboard for non-labor adjustments, this is what they would see to tell them, hey, maintenance has actually submitted a request. And if I were to click on this, rather than just hovering over here to see what this amount is, I'd actually be able to see the comments in here and either accept or reject any kind of change that needs to be made to the project. So rather than sending emails back and forth from one source to another, through a solution like this, different kinds of adjustments that need to be made in order to address those variances they see in milestones can be directly modified, with communication being able to be easily audited by anyone in the chain. That is what we had prepared for this demo. As you can see, we have a few other items. So if you are interested, we can talk further in another session. So feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Kate. So great job. I think that shows, again, just to recap, a lot of those primary baseline integrated project planning financial questions, right? That both a program manager who's going to be responsible, their supervisor who has to make sure that, you know, their resource requests are going to be approved in a part of the larger major programs that are being worked on for the organization, as well as the folks that actually own the resources, right? All those suppliers that Kate referenced, the department managers, they really need to ensure that they too can modify and make decisions that are either increasing their headcount or swapping across different parts of the organization to make sure that those big satellite programs that Kate showed can get executed on. So what's next after that baseline financial solution is stood up? Next is really considering the near-term solution, which is looking at, you know, the flexibility of integrating and considering earned value, which everything that Kate showed in that demo is really looking at the financials, right? At that work breakdown structure. What is the cost? How is that cost being reforecasted as the data is coming through and as decisions are being made on the program? And this is really looking at, you know, as my project is actually being executed on, how much value am I getting based on what my end dates of my programs are? And what is the financial impact of adding an additional engineering head or manufacturing head on the P&L and on the cash flow? So that's the next stage in the journey here as we look at evolving the project planning solution. And then finally, double clicking to get to the true integrated financial and operational planning needs here. It's really looking at the individual named resource planning and looking at the roles to understand, from a bird's eye view, what resources do we have in excess, and what is the impact of that excess on the rest of the organization? And also, how do we consider any new proposals or estimates in order to attain new business? And looking at also suppliers to make sure we've got cost savings across the board as we're evaluating those. So here is that's really the end-to-end integrated financial planning process. If folks have any questions, otherwise we'll be going into the fireside chat and Q&A, because we're really excited to have Yasser here to talk through his journey along this maturity model and also his connected planning processes. Sarah, Ellen, have we gotten any questions on the maturity model or demo, or should we dive into the fireside chat?
I think they're coming in. Dive in.
Okay, great. So to start, Yasser, I think would love to hear from your perspective. You've transitioned serving as an interim CFO. How has this optimized your processes as you look at that end-to-end connected planning roadmap, right?
Yeah. Okay. So what I'll say is right now, having this source data and this capability has made it possible for us to, what I'll say is, as we are trying to issue our disclosure statement in the next month around being fully compliant, it allows us a top level understanding of, frankly, the problems we are facing in the resource demands in today's world at a granular level that I wasn't able to get previously. So we can better understand and forecast our revenue, our cash flow in this current state. And it actually was frankly, the only reason we were able to actually produce and sign up to an AOP, because we really didn't have any detailed data as we were implementing all these transition plans moving into our strategic roadmap over the next 3 years. And it was a complete pivot of almost 180 degrees of what our prior year financial data was. And there just wasn't any other way to assess it other than going completely offline, and there's no way it could have been done in the timeline. So what I'll say is this was the single enabling tool that allowed us the capability to truly get verifiable data that I felt comfortable putting in front of a board of directors and presenting.
Great, that makes a lot of sense in terms of the financial side of kind of the presentation at the more, accurate and aggregate level. I'm curious from a manufacturing lens, as you look at optimizing the utilization in your factories and business, how has that helped at more the operational level as well?
So what I'll say is at the operational level, it's always a learning process. And as we all know, there's always cultural issues at a company. There's a lot of, what I'll say, work getting acceptance. What you see is this spreads across 200 people. I'd be lying if I told everybody on the phone, and they would know this, that you get immediate acceptance across the board by every person. They love a new process that's rolled out. What I'll say is getting the data in there, the managers and key leaders who are trying to better understand their resource shortfalls, they're actually leveraging the data to make business cases for them around where we truly need staffing in place. Because historically, what tends to happen is a manager comes in and says, yeah, my gut feel is I'm short 2 heads, or I think I might be overstaffed by a head. They couldn't actually produce data to back up their position. So ultimately what would happen would be they would just keep doing their job, keep their heads down, and not realize they're costing the company millions of dollars because they're not staffing up where required, or potentially staffing down when needed. So what this gives that manager the capability to do is really put on that manager/leader hat and not just default into their standard IC role of let me jump in and do somebody else's job, or let me try to help, not understanding you might be fixing the short-term issue, but not addressing a long-term problem that you have an understaffing issue for 5 to 10 heads for a year. So you jumping in is not a feasible solution, and eliminates their ability from focusing on the strategic side, focusing on what we need to do as a business. And ultimately you think you're helping, but you're really hurting because you didn't have all the data sets to evaluate your core problems in your department as your CAM with your oversight of your deliverables. All these things, these cross-cuts of data are truly invaluable in terms of making decisions as a lower level manager.
That makes sense.
All the way up to executive.
So Yasser, here's more specific question, but how would manufacturing companies look at what you've done or look at Anaplan to help, bringing finance and operational processes together?
Well, what I'll tell you is even within Anaplan, and something that wasn't shown here, is there are model maps built into Anaplan that are literally clickable icons that tell you your data sources, your interdependencies in your system, and almost help you design workflow processes to understand where your data controls are, where your decision-making controls are, and how it results in an output. So you can truly understand all the way from core source data to deliverable, output and decision, what goes into the process. And it really has helped in terms of, frankly, a lot of our data mapping, work stream mapping, policies and procedures updates we've had to implement for government compliance. Without it, we probably would have been dead in the water and would have had to pay a lot more money to external consultants than we already are. So what I'll say is it's, as we all know, as finance leaders and other leaders in an organization, the key is spending your money efficiently. We all know it's a capital intensive, complex business, but the key is really where you spend drives your business, addressing the right problems, because it's always going to cost money. And this was, an immeasurable, I'd say, one of the best investments our company has made in the last 20 years in terms of trying to figure out a creative way to address a complex problem that's been on the table for, ever since I started here back in the year 2000. So it was a problem that was brewing for a decade, that ERP, financial tools replacement, work stream mapping, workflow planning, all these things were things that were on our CapEx replacement plan when I joined the company in 2000. And until I was in a position to make changes in 2012, were just left ignored year after year. And the inefficiency was just absorbed. And frankly, I can tell you that this has saved us tens of millions of dollars and has been an enabling mechanism to route into new markets in our environment.
I'm curious, Yasser, for those on the line in the space that are looking at where to make their bets and start on this journey, can you walk through back on your timeline as you started at the P&L and making that decision, kind of walking through why you chose to start there and kind of the reasoning for placing that bet and then layering on the operations and cash flow afterwards?
Sure. What I'll say is when I first, became a senior director in the company and was trying to figure out what the business needs. I'd been hearing for the past 10 years, we need a full ERP replacement. We need a full ERP replacement. So, at first I listened and I said, okay, well, we need to get a full ERP. The problem is almost everybody in this call will probably understand and agree with, a board of directors never approves an ERP based on cost savings, and you can never justify an ERP on cost savings. So you're usually stuck in a situation that ultimately forces creative thinking. So after 2 years of attempting to look at ERP replacement, I decided that the right thing to do is actually go into a deeper dive and see, do I actually have good source data? And once I dove into our systems, even though they were terrible, they have their problems. What I'll say is they're on local servers, they're potentially aged out. ultimately what I saw was the big bang for the buck to get savings was, if I trust the data and if I trust it can be maintained, I needed to figure out how to better create KPIs for the business and how to better manage the business and try to figure out the right areas to invest in. So what I did was I was going to a lot of CFO forums, a lot of these discussions around, where the industry is going. And I started reading about potential latch-on tools, ultimately based on, whether or not full ERP replacement was really the right way to go for CFOs and businesses looking into the future. And I saw that there were a lot of tools and innovators coming into the area. Adaptive technologies is one that people know. There's Anaplan, there's a few others. Obviously, there's SAP has their own cloud analytics. So what I'll say is we looked at it and said, what does our business need? And I said, we build custom satellites. So ultimately, an out-of-the-box solution is not probably going to work for us. So we need to be creative, think through the process, map and say, we need to define the construct and not take an out-of-the-box fit-to-form discussion with SAP to tell us how to run our business. We need to define how our business needs to run, define our KPIs. And ultimately, when you look at the roadmap for designing and implementing new tools, best practices says you need to define your top level GL construct as leaders in the organization. So all of the problem solvers and ICs can figure out how best to design solutions associated with what you're asking for. If you can't define solution criteria, you can't, acceptance criteria, release success factors, then your business is set up to fail to begin with, because you don't know what you want your people to be doing to optimize your execution. So if you can't define it, they can't execute. So we took it on ourselves to say, attack the P&L. We define the construct. We define what they need to be doing to optimize execution. And then once we define that, they can drive the solutions, so you can start attacking cash flow modeling, fixed asset management, operations forecasting, ultimately long-term new business planning, on an integrated basis, developing cost models, all the things you can do if you define your business appropriately. And ultimately, that's why I referenced before why we took a pause after our first P&L rollout and decided to take a step back, because we didn't want to attack all those things originally in our roadmap, because we knew we were changing the business construct. So you were ultimately going to just have a bunch of rework and ultimately not get bang for your buck. So we decided to pause, take a step back, refigure it out, and then hit the ground running again in 2018.
Great. So that makes sense where you started. And, we can obviously saw the past few months and the past year really has been a ton of optimization, right? Yasser, especially this latest optimization to get down from the program and org level down to that work breakdown structure or task level, to enable the operations team to really have that accurate data. What is as we kind of zoom out from the beginning and look for next steps, what's your complete vision for Anaplan at Maxar and kind of the next steps?
Yeah, so great question. I mean, we had laid out, and I'll say Spaulding was essential in this one too. We had laid out basically a forecast and financial management modernization roadmap a couple of years ago, and ultimately included in that was, I'd say, a high-level view around what we were trying to do was just tied around integrated planning. Ultimately, the idea here is what I've learned over my 20-year career is integrated data that a company can use and leverage all the time is much more valuable than, even if it's wrong, because it creates alignment in thought, as opposed to a local analysis that may be right, but nobody knows they're supposed to be referencing or use. So ultimately, it doesn't help the business. So my overarching vision was all around saying, what we need to do is optimize the data points that the business needs to be feeding in to the system, create better tools for them to utilize so they want to use our tools and our dashboards, so that it is an overarching decision-making process. We are getting real-time useful data for executives, senior managers, executives, even corporate layer, to be able to understand the decisions we're making and based on aligned thought process. Because what tends to happen all the time in business is one person thinks they're helping, and they truly in their heart feel they're helping the business, but they're doing something 180 degrees opposite of what the business wants them to do, because they thought that we were going to win one program, or one BD guy went and talked to them and said, hey, this is going to happen, so go work on this, this, and that. And then what happens is they don't understand the business hasn't agreed on that. The business is not prioritizing that. And ultimately, they're shifting their resources to the wrong things and potentially costing us millions of dollars, because they're taking those resources off of the wrong project. The one that we need to drive a key win, but ultimately that one BD guy didn't know about when he went and used his leveraged relationship to go and ask the question. So bringing it back to the 30,000 foot level, ultimately it's around alignment with your business and creating a single source of truth to better plan how your business is going in the current year, how you're growing, your strategic growth plan is aligned with a set of new business assumptions, new product technologies, investment prioritization in one system, so we can all be making the right decisions real time at any point in time. Because we all know when we talk to a corporate layer, they're going to ask a question whenever they ask a question, and it's not always aligned to when you are ready to give an answer. So you'd love to be able to depend on the data sources you have to provide the answers they're asking for.
Great. Is there any other questions that have come through, Sarah and Ellen?
No, I think you've tackled a couple of those.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I'm curious, Yasser, how, as we look at the past year, there's been a lot of change in the Anaplan optimization, and obviously we've all gone through a lot of change with the pandemic and COVID, and I'm curious, tackling all of that change, what are some of the areas that Maxar has been most affected by COVID, and what steps are being taken there, as we've also gone through a lot of internal, tooling transformation as well?
Absolutely. So as we all know, COVID has been a significant challenge for all businesses. What I'll say is, we filed for and received the essential worker exception. So ultimately we were able to keep our operations running. But what I will tell you was our ability to navigate through and actually get useful data from managers around which specific areas in our business were impacted by work from home environments, people who were not allowed to come on site, having to have 6 feet of social distancing on campus, was once again another essential data point for us to help understand what were our fixed cost growth associated with a COVID compliant work environment around cleaning costs, all the things we optimized, put in POs, created separate WBS charge numbers to track those costs. So we were quickly able to model out, and ultimately I was able to deliver what I'll say a 90% accurate COVID impact analysis within days of the entire situation coming to light, to where we ultimately were blind for about a week. And then within a week, we were able to lay out models and assess what was going to happen as the laws were coming in real time. And as many people know, we're based in California. California's had very unique restrictions versus many other states. And we ultimately were literally just feeding in data real time that was coming from the, HR rules, that were coming in from security rules, that were coming in from our environmental health and safety teams. All these things, they were feeding us inputs, and we were able to account for them very quickly. And I'd say frankly, when you look at, even if you look at Maxar's finances and how we performed on the year, majority of charges were taken in at the end of Q1 close. We had already assessed them, and basically we did not flow through any other COVID impacts for the rest of the year.
Great. Well, it's great to see that you guys were able to tackle so much externally, internally with the latest optimizations across the board. So Yasser and everyone on the line wanted to thank you for your time today. Really appreciated the dialogue and to walk through, this true integrated solution and planning that has been a long journey, I know, and we've had a lot of great wins, Yasser, that your team's been able to kind of take advantage of and are looking forward to leveraging as you continue on that journey. So with that, we'll wrap it up and look forward to any additional questions sent our way after the webinar.